Welcome to LidyPod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beasley.
So Dave, here we are for LidyPod 6. Can't believe we're on 6.
I know, we did 6 and people are still enjoying it. This is great.
Apparently they are. We've come away from our usual location. Well, not our usual location, but we started the last LidyPod 5, in our breakfast haunt, didn't we?
We did, and I'd have to say, please bear with us. We have not had our full English breakfast this morning, so we apologise now.
Yeah, we feel a little bit grumpy. That's probably why. But we're actually not that far away from the tavern where we often meet. We're in an area of Liverpool known as Wavertree. Now, Wavertree in Old English literally means wavering tree, and like so many other places around Liverpool, the villages of Woolton, where that such important meeting of John and Paul took place, West Derby, where the Casbah is located. All of these places were villages in their own right before the town or the city expanded and took them over. And that was also the case in Wavertree, because Wavertree was mentioned in the Domesday Book, and the Domesday Book was created in 1086, so the latter part of the 11th century. So it was mentioned in there, and it really only became part of Liverpool in 1895, when the growing city was moving outwards and it was taken into the city boundary. But it's actually a really, really interesting place, and there's so many little features to Wavertree which often go unmissed because people are either just heading into or out of the city centre, or as you will find out why in a few moments, visiting a Beatles location here. And some of the places to mention, there's a lock-up here, isn't there, Dave?
I love the lock-up. This is one of my favourite buildings in the whole of Liverpool.
Yeah, the lock-up was created in 1794, and as the name suggests, it was for locking people up. I suppose a sort of modern-day drunk tank, really, where if somebody was found drunk overnight, the constable would put them in the lock-up and leave them there until the next morning when they sobered up. The place also has, and this is literally just around the corner from where we are at the moment, the place that was originally the smallest house in England. And in fact, the Magical Mystery Tour bus stops right by this building to let the passengers off. There's also a clock here, the Picton clock, which was paid for by Sir James Picton. He was one of the notables of the area. He was an architect, a historian, a politician. That went up in 1884. And also the Blue Coat School, a very well-known school in Liverpool, founded originally in the city centre, but located in Wavertree since the early part of the 20th century.
And of course there are Beatles connections with the Blue Coat School.
Oh, tell us, Dave.
Yeah, first of all, that is where Alf Lennon and his sister ended up in boarding school. When Alf's father died, his mum couldn't afford to bring up all the children, so Alf and his sister were sent to the boarding school, and that boarding school was the Blue Coat, which is just up the road from Penny Lane. And where did they take all the lads to get their haircut? A little barbershop called Bioletti's, which might well pop up in the song of Penny Lane. So Alf Lennon was literally just down the road from here. The other connection is Nigel Wally. Nigel, John's childhood friend, who became the manager of the Quarrymen, got them into the cavern, got them all the early bookings as well. So lots of links with everywhere. Yeah,
lots of links indeed, and a really interesting little suburb of Liverpool. And if you do come on a visit to Liverpool and you do some of the Beatles sites, you will undoubtedly come here, because just explain why, Dave.
Of course, Wavertree is where there's a little road called Arnold Grove, and at number 12 Arnold Grove is where George Harrison was born.
Ah, right, okay, so that's why we are literally just around the corner from Arnold Grove and number 12. So tell us about George's life here in Wavertree, Dave.
Well, George's family home, 12 Arnold Grove, was your typical working class house, a bit like Ringo's that we talked about in the earlier LidyPod. So it was your typical Victorian 2 up, 2 down. So 2 bedrooms upstairs, 2 rooms downstairs, so living room at the front, kitchen dining room at the back. No bathroom in the house, no toilet in the house, toilets in the little brick building at the bottom of the yard. And it's quite good if you do come here on a tour. It's worth standing basically where we are now, looking at the sides of the houses, because you can actually see how narrow the houses are front to back And where they've put an extension now to put in the bathroom, you can see, well, that takes you to the back wall. That's where the toilet was. So these are small houses, but everybody had exactly the same around here. So they just got on with it.
So this is what we would call in Britain a typical 2 up, 2 down house.
Yeah, absolutely. And whereas that wasn't a massive problem for Ringo, because obviously from the age of 3, his dad had left home, so it was just him and his mum. But George was the youngest of 4 children. Plus, out of all the Beatles, he was the only one who grew up with a stable family life of his mum and dad still together. Because, of course, say Ringo's dad walked out when they were only 3. Paul lost his mum when he was 14. John lost his mum, well, taken away from her when he was 5, and then lost her when he was 17. So it's a small house, it's a working class house, quite basic, but the good thing for George was he had a stable family there. Now that made it a little bit cramped, because you've only got 2 bedrooms, and with there being 4 kids, and there's 12 years between Louise as the oldest and George as the youngest, all crammed into this one room, and probably into one giant double bed, ham to top and tail and stuff. So it would have been very, very cosy. Now Louise Harrison, George's sister, brought a book out a couple of years ago called My Kid Brother, and it's about George and her and their family life. So I interviewed her, a lovely chat with Louise, and I asked her what it was like growing up in such a small house, and she said, well, we didn't know any different. All the houses around here are exactly the same, so as kids you just get on with it. She only realised that they didn't have a bath and a toilet in the house when after school she went to a friend's house. They were a bit more well off and they had a bathroom toilet in the house. So he said, we didn't know any different, and it was a really happy family home. And the parents, Harold and Louise, were lovely people, and gave them every encouragement in life. So that worked out very well for George, and say born here and lived here till just before his 7th birthday.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, that, because living in a house with 6 people, 2 bedrooms, not abnormal at the time, Dave. That was fairly normal, and also had this stable upbringing in the sense that there was no parental breakup and there was no parental loss during his childhood. So in that sense, very, very, very happy. So if he moved away from here just before he was 7, he must have been going to school when he was living at 12 Arnold Grove.
Yeah, so in 1948, age of 5, he was enrolled into Dovedale School, which is one of the best primary schools. Not that I'm biased, apart from the fact my daughters went there and I'm the chair of governors, but apart from it is still a fantastic school. And of course that's the school where John Lennon also attended, but John was 2 years above George, was actually in the same class with George's older brother Peter. So Peter and George would walk to the school. They go down Church Road, they go through the Penny Lane roundabout, you go down Penny Lane to the school and then walk back again. So yeah, a good bit of exercise. The significance of Penny Lane we'll come back to in a future episode, because to really understand what that song means. Yeah, so this was George's area, and it was a nice little place. But you were saying about living in a cramped house, because they were council houses, and I know we mentioned this before with Ringo's house. So you paid a rent to the local council, the local government. Now what you did was, if you had a growing family, you went on the waiting list for a bigger house. So the Harrisons put their name down. 17 years they waited from putting their name on the list till they finally moved. So even before George was born, they were already on the waiting list. But of course there was a huge housing shortage before the Second World War, and then we lost thousands of houses during the war because of the bomb damage. So it was an even bigger housing crisis after the war. So the waiting lists were huge, so they just had to wait until they could finally get a bigger house.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, being on the waiting list for 70 years might sound terrible, but there were people who at that time didn't have a house because they might have been bombed out of their house. They were living with neighbours or relatives or just friends. So having a house was just put you at the bottom of the list, didn't it, really? Yeah. So interesting. He would have walked, maybe about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes to get to Dovedale Road School from here.
Yeah, it's a nice straight route, just straight down, say towards the Penny Lane roundabout, and you're there. It's a good school, and in George's recollections, he really enjoyed his time at Dovedale, as did John. You know, it was a good school, but you allowed, if you were creative, as both George and John were, you were allowed that a chance for you to flourish if you are creative, and so they could draw, they could write, they could do all kinds of great stuff. And of course, as John and George would later comment, even though they passed their 11 plus exam to go to grammar school, George says when he went to the Liverpool Institute, most of the time he hated that, because there was no enjoyment, there was no allowance for creativity, and it was all, you have to learn this, cram all this into your head. And so for most kids, yeah, primary school was great. So Dovedale was fantastic for George, though he never met George there. And though of course he never met John while he was there. It was only years later, when they were in the Quarrymen, they realised he'd actually been at the same school.
Yeah, that's incredible. Now, a couple of things I want you to clear up here, Dave. First of all, there has been talk, and there was talk a number of years ago, about the date on which George was born. Everybody knows it's the 25th of February 1943. Just tell us what the controversy was.
Well, it's whether it went with urban myth, possibly perpetuated by George, who had a very dry sense of humour, just to add a little bit of confusion, because his mum went into labour on the 24th, and George was born not long after midnight. So for many people, that's the night of the 24th, though actually that's the early morning of the 25th. So if you go back to birth certificates and to his baptism certificates, it's all registered at the 25th of February. Though interestingly, when I was talking to Jeff Nugent, who's a great guitarist with the Undertakers, top Liverpool band, he became good friends with George when they lived up in Speke. And Jeff had his birthday on the 23rd, and he remembers George celebrating his birthday on the 24th, even though it was the 25th and not the 24th. Are you with that? Yeah?
No, not really.
No. So to clear that one up, it's definitely the 25th of February 43.
That's great. Now, the other thing is, if people have ever been to Arnold Grove on a tour, they may have seen images of it. People often take photographs here, and take photographs of the sign as well. And underneath the sign of Arnold Grove, there's another little long sign which says unadopted. Tell us what that is, Dave.
Well, this goes back to the point that Liverpool only became a city in 1880 under Queen Victoria. Up until that point, you know, all these places, Wavertree, West Derby, like you were explaining before, were little townships in their own right. They were then all adopted into the new city constitution. But little roads like Arnold Grove, and if you've seen pictures, if you haven't, we'll post them on when we do on the YouTube podcast. You see pictures of Arnold Grove. It's a short street. Back then it was privately owned, and so those little streets that were privately owned weren't formally adopted into the new city constitution. So the private landowner was responsible for the upkeep, particularly of the roads, the pavements, etc. And they were never, and have never, been formally adopted into the city of Liverpool. So technically and legally, there's about 200 unadopted streets all around Liverpool.
Yeah, and there are thousands of them around the country, aren't they? But most of them, in my experience, are not labelled as unadopted, so you would only know if you lived there or you happen to work in the departments of the council that had to deal with unadopted roads. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and often people do ask about that, don't they? They do ask, what does unadopted mean? Yeah, it's an interesting feature.
You're listening to Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beesley.
So, Dave, getting back to George's life here in Wavertree, in Arnold Grove. I mean, as was the case with most people, your whole life was in that little area, wasn't it? So tell us about some of the places around this area that George would have interacted with.
Well, the closest one is the next road, which is Albert Grove. And that's where George's maternal grandparents lived. So quite often, George would spend his time there. You know, if his dad was either in bed or was on a late shift or something, and he was home from school, he'd just go to his grandparents' house. So that's quite handy, just the next little road there. And that's often the way the families lived and stayed in the same area. Most of George's dad, Harold's family, were from Wavertree anyway. So they're all quite close. But that in itself brings a sadness, which is, it tells you what Liverpool was like at the time. It was very sectarian. One of the biggest problems was, as George found out with his family, his dad was a Protestant, or Anglican Episcopalian, all based from the Church of England as we know it. But his mum, Louise, was a Catholic. Now back then that was considered a mixed marriage, and that could have consequences, and it did in George's family, because George's dad, Harold, for marrying a Catholic, was effectively cut off from his family because he was marrying out of his religion. Now this goes back hundreds of years, and we talked about this again with Ringo. The Protestants and the Catholics have hated each other, and it goes back to the Battle of the Boyne over in Ireland. So that's why the Troubles have flared there for so many years. So Belfast has been probably the worst of the places for the sectarian violence. But then Glasgow has that issue, and then after that it's Liverpool. And there was, particularly back then, was a real hatred between Protestants and Catholics. And so this was seen as Harold moving out of his religion to marry. And so that's why he was cut off. And it is sad. And funnily enough, I was looking through an old copy of Merseybeat, and just in the corner there was an advert, and it was quite weird. I had to do a double take, because it said, are you considering marrying a Catholic? If you're considering a mixed marriage, there are all kinds of consequences. For a consultation, please ring Father, whatever his name was, and so you go and talk to the parish priest, so you wouldn't be marrying outside the Catholic religion.
That's I mean, in the modern day, that seems strange, but back in the day, that was just run of the mill, really, especially in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow and places like that. Interesting that you should bring religion into it, Dave. Just tell us about the church that was local to George.
Yeah, literally just down the road, a couple of hundred yards down there. On the right is Our Lady of Good Help. And if you think we're just doing this from anywhere, we are now going to prove that we are literally here in Wavertree, because Storm Gareth has hit.
It is absolutely blowing a gale at the moment. So we're sitting in a car, getting away from the gale, because it just would be too windy. Can you hear the wind? Can you hear the wind there? Yeah. So let's put the windows back up and get back to some sort of warmth away from this gale.
Yeah. If we can't have a breakfast, at least we can stay warm and dry. So yeah, just down the road, and if we actually look out now, here comes the sun.
Yeah, you're right, actually. We've been sitting here, it's been really overcast, and all of a sudden, as we talk about George, here comes the sun. It's brightening up. A bit of blue suburban sky there as well, Dave. But anyway, yeah, tell us more about the church.
Yeah, the little church just down the road here is Our Lady of Good Help, and this is where George was baptised. It's a Catholic church. And of course, back then, everything was in Latin. So if you look at the baptism certificate, he's actually down as Georgius Harrison. So he never mentioned that for some reason. Can't think why. One of the Fab Four, here's Georgius Harrison. So he was born into and raised really as a Catholic in this mixed marriage. So that was quite awkward. That manifests itself when he started at Dovedale School. So say it's literally 10-15 minute walk down the road. The law had recently changed to say that you could opt out your child from the daily religious assembly.
So just clarify, every school would have a period, short time of religious assembly, getting together, active worship in the school.
Yeah, you'd have a hymn, and you maybe have a Bible reading or something, a religious thought for the day. And of course that would be backed by the official church of the country. It was the Church of England. So if you were a Catholic and it wasn't a Catholic school, your child would have had to listen to a Protestant daily worship. When the law changed, the parents could then opt them out, and that is what George's parents did. So they were one of the very few in Dovedale School who said yes, they didn't want their son to go to the daily religious worship. So a bit of that religious rebellion started at a very young age, the age of 5. George effectively is being told, because he'd had to explain why he wasn't going in there. So that sort of rebellion starts very, very young, and you think that he's the one you consider the spiritual or the religious Beatle. That rebellion started quite young, and even when he was at the Liverpool Institute, his grammar school, same issue. He could be excluded from that. But what they used to do at the Institute was, if you were late or you're one of these excluded, they'd wait till the religious part had finished. When it came to the notices, all the lads would have to be marched right down the centre of the hall, all eyes looking on them, sit at the very front and be stared at by the headmaster. So it was interesting.
Yeah, because, this change in the law didn't mean there was a mass exodus from religious worship. There were actually very, very few people in any one school that would have asked for this.
Yeah, because when you look at the logbook in Dovedale, all the register for all the names, etc., George, on that page of 30 names, whatever there is, he's the only one who was excluded. So virtually all of his classmates, everyone in his year, would be in the assembly every morning. George would be kept outside. So, yeah, he would have to be told why this was happening.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that day. Really interesting, especially in view of the fact that George ended up as being the most religious of the four of them, without a doubt. Now, just before we move from Wavertree and leave Arnold Grove behind, let's pose a little bit of a question for our Facebook page, Dave, because here in Wavertree there are actually a couple of locations and a road which actually featured in the original lyrics of what went on to be a very, very famous Beatles song. And what we want to do, and you can post your answer on Facebook, what we want to know is what were those locations, and also what was the song as well. Do you think that's a fair question?
Well, it is, because we know the answer, so that's always going to be fair. If you want to look up the answer, it's in my first book, Liverpool. How good was that? Blatant sale pitch, come on.
That sounds like a good way of doing it. Yeah, so the locations in Wavertree, literally around the corner from where George Harrison was born and lived up to the age of 7, that featured in the original lyrics. And these original lyrics were not actually used in the end, but featured in the original lyrics of a famous song by the Beatles. Tell us what the locations are, and also tell us what the song is as well. Put it on our Facebook page.
This is Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beasley.
I must just mention this from Jennifer. She emailed in and she called us Liddypodlians.
Liddypodlians.
Yeah. So we started the first episode of saying that we're not Liverpudlians, we're Liverpolitans. But now, if you listen to Liddypod, you're a Liddypodlian.
That's a great one, that. A Liddypodlian.
Yeah.
That'll do for me. Who was that, Dave?
That was from Jennifer. So thank you for that nice feedback. Also had a couple of suggestions for giving out our MBEs, our Mr. Brian Epstein Awards. Good ones for people mentioned Mona Best, so we'll do that. And an interesting one to do for Astrid. And of course, Astrid was the great photographer and friend of the Beatles out in Hamburg. So that'd be a really interesting one to do as well. So keep those suggestions coming in. And the final one must mention from Carol. She jumping in on the fifth Beatle debate. Now, of course, we posed this to Ken Womack last time. Now, is George Martin or Brian Epstein the fifth Beatle? And she says, as far as she's concerned, to be a fifth Beatle, in spite of the great contributions Brian and George Martin made, you've really got to be a member of the group. So she would go for Stuart Sutcliffe.
Well, do you know what? That's an interesting idea, because, yeah, if we are calling the fifth Beatle, then yeah, good point. Good. Was that Carol?
That was Carol. So again, thank you for the feedback. It's always great to hear. I'm going to give you little mentions as well. So thanks for the feedback. So don't forget, answer on the competition, and we'll give the answer out next time.
Subscribe at liddypod.com and you'll never miss another episode.
So, Dave, we've been talking about George Harrison growing up in Arnold Grove in Wavertree, but as you alluded to, he moved from here, didn't he, just before his 7th birthday?
Yeah, because it was a small house, and the Harrisons went on the housing waiting list, and they waited 17 years to get a bigger house. They ended up in a new housing estate that was being built on the outskirts of Liverpool, in the far south, an area called Speke. So in 1950, so just before George was 7, the Harrisons moved on to this new housing estate. They went to 25 Upton Green, and they were there then until 1962, when they moved to Mackett's Lane on the edge of Walton. By a nice coincidence, and as you'll know, there are so many coincidences in the Beatles story. 3 years earlier, the McCartney family had moved onto the same housing estate of Speke. So when George passed his 11 plus and went on to the Liverpool Institute, he got on the bus, and on the next stop, Paul McCartney got on the bus. And because they had the same school uniform, going to the same school, they became mates on the bus to and from school. And that's where they became friends, and they started then learning guitar together.
Now, before you think, well, hang on a minute, there must have been loads of people on the bus with the same school uniform. How would they pick each other out? Explain why chances were that probably they might have been the only two people on that bus with that school uniform on.
Yeah, to get to a grammar school, you had to pass the 11 plus exam. Now, schools like Dovedale, where George and John were, they were seen as the schools that would get your child through the 11 plus. Basically, it determined your life at the age of 11, which was why, thankfully, it was stopped. Because if you pass this 11 plus exam, and the one John said it's the only exam he ever tried to pass, you went to a grammar school. If you went to a grammar school, that would get you into the profession. So you could be, you could be in law, you could be in teaching, you could be in medicine, etc. If you failed it, or like in Ringo's case, weren't put in for it, you went to a secondary modern. And that's a completely different type of school, because in that school you were prepared for manual labour. So the grammar schools were trying to take the elite. Now, from the whole of Liverpool, there was only a handful of grammar schools, so not many people pass the exam and can actually get to go to a grammar school. So there wouldn't have been that many kids on the bus with the Liverpool Institute uniform on. So that's how they recognised the uniform and thought, kindred spirit, and that's how they became mates.
That's interesting. That so they met on this regular bus journey. Take it from there, if you would, Dave.
So, of course, first thing that comes up from George, by this time he'd become completely obsessed with the guitars. Education didn't matter one thing to him. He didn't like the Institute, didn't enjoy it at all. He loved Dovedale, place to be creative. He got bored at the Institute. A lot of his school books, apparently, they were just drawings of different guitars. He would just doodle guitars all the time. And as soon as he got a guitar, and again, full credit to Harold and Louise, his parents, they paid £3, which for a working class family with not a massive income, it was a lot of money to find. But they wanted to give their best to their son. So George would then take his guitar into school, and Paul would then do the same. And they'd be learning guitar in each other's houses, learning to get better, to play together. But then they would play together in the school as well. So they became really good friends. So when, at the end of 1957, Paul's joined the Quarrymen, and they realised they needed a lead guitarist, Paul suggests his mate George Harrison to come and join.
Okay, but his entry into the band wasn't instant, was it, Dave?
It wasn't. The same problem where George had tried to join the group that became Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He was dating Iris Caldwell. Her brother Alan Caldwell became Rory Storm. And so when he was dating Iris, he asked to join Alan's group, and he said, no, you're too young. And this was the same problem that John had, because John was born 1940. So he was October 40. He's 2.5 years before George was there. When you're a teenager, that's a huge gap. John didn't want this little kid just hanging around with him, so he kept saying no. So the question is, when did George Harrison join the Quarrymen?
Now, there's an interesting one. I think I know what most people will say, but as is always the case with David Bedford, Beatles detective, as I've called you, you'll probably have another answer for us.
Yes, you're right. Would you like to know the answer?
I certainly would like to know the answer, Mr. Detective.
So this came when I was working on my second book, the Fab 104, and I was looking at all the musicians from the first lineup of the Quarrymen right through to the end of 1962, by which time Ringo was in. So I've got 104 people, all the musicians and the people who contributed to making them a group. Now, the date we'd always been given was 6th of February 1958. because it was outside Wilson Hall. Or Colin Hanton, the Quarrymen drummer, he always recalled the date as the date when the Morgue opened. Now that was the club out in Old Swan that Rory Storm opened. So that was in the March of 58. And George supposedly auditioned that night. So we had these two dates. I think, okay, which one's which? And I ended up, I was talking with Rod Davis, banjo player with the Quarrymen and their resident historian. And he and I have picked apart Quarrymen history a number of times. And we got talking because we know that when George Harrison joined, that meant Eric Griffiths was kicked out of the group. So that's where the starting point. Now, of course, as we know all the way through, the Quarrymen / Beatles were never very good at sacking people and getting rid of them. Yes, that's another debate, as we know. So George had auditioned, now we know this, top deck of a bus outside Wilson Hall in Garston. By George joining him, Eric was kicked out. Eric got so fed up he put his guitar away and he went off and he joined the Merchant Navy. Now, when we went digging back, we found the dates when Eric joined the Merchant Navy. So me being me, I tracked down his Merchant Navy records to find when he joined his first ship. He joined it on the 13th of February 1958. He cannot have quit on the 6th of February, if that's when George supposedly joined, and definitely not in March. It had to be earlier. So then you trace it back and you had to do an exam. So he qualified in the middle of January 58, which means he must have joined in the middle of December 1957. In that case, when did the Quarrymen play Wilson Hall at that time? And it's around the 7th of December 1957. So therefore, George's audition and entrance into the group must have happened after the gig on the 7th of December 1957, when on the top deck of the bus, he gets his guitar out and he plays Raunchy. And John says, "That's brilliant, you've got to join the group." So that's the evidence. That's what the evidence tells us. It had to have been early December 1957 that George joined the Quarrymen, which means when you look at the whole history of the Quarrymen, Paul and John meet 6th of July 57. 5 months later, virtually all the Quarrymen who were there that day Paul first saw them are out of the group, and John, Paul and George are together. End of 1957. There's your core of your Beatles together.
That's fascinating, because that brings forward by a good 2 months the date at which George joined the band, and actually puts the meetings of the three of them, John, Paul and George, all within a short space of time in the middle to latter part of 1957, rather than stretching over to 1958.
Yep, so there you go. And again, you know what I'm like, you have to follow the evidence, and we know from those events that's how it happened. And the only way Eric found out he'd been replaced, he'd heard a rumour they were practising at Paul's, and from what Colin Hanton can remember, it was him who answered the phone and spoke to Eric and said, "Sorry, you're not in the group." And that was it. Eric went off and joined the Merchant Navy. So
really interesting. I knew the Beatles detective would get to the bottom of that one. Dave Bedford, Beatles detective indeed.
Liddypod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beasley.
So you're listening to Liddypod 6, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beasley, talking today about George Harrison. We've been through the story when he grew up in Wavertree, when he moved to the new housing estate of Speke. He met John in what we now know was not the early part of 1958, but the latter part of 1957. But tell us, Dave, just about his musical contribution to the band.
Anybody you speak to who was around in the Liverpool groups at the time, or has played with him, or has watched him, will tell you what a great guitarist he was. And you could see the influences of people like Chet Atkins. I think George, yeah, he was the quiet Beatle. He was the funny Beatle, which people don't give him credit for. If you think, I think of two crucial meetings in their early history. The first one, when they're having their first meeting with Brian Epstein, and Paul McCartney's late, and Brian wants to know where he is because Brian loved everyone to be on time. And he comes back in fuming and he says, "I can't believe it. Paul's only just getting out of the bath. He's going to be very late." And George said, "Yes, but very clean." I thought, brilliant. So he broke the ice there. He does the same thing on their first meeting with George Martin in June '62. They're in the control room and they're talking through how everything's gone. And George Martin effectively gives them a 20-minute lecture. The lads are stunned and says, "Now, is there anything you want to ask, or is there anything you don't like?" Silence, and then George says, "I don't like your tie." Of course, it was a risk, but George Martin, having worked with the Goons and everybody, he loved that. And that's because musically it wasn't a particularly exciting audition, but the personalities of John, Paul and George, the Goonish humour, broke through. So he could come up with some really good stuff like that. But musically, it's like we said when we talked about Ringo. You know, go back and listen to the Beatles songs for the drumming. Go and listen to the songs for George's guitar work. Now, he may not have been a great blues lead guitar player like Eric Clapton, but what George contributed, some of those licks he was doing behind John's rhythm guitar, they make the song stand out. And he was a great, great guitarist. Of course, he was a really good singer. Don't forget, until they start making the records, the singing is shared between John, Paul and George equally. It was the only way to survive. And he would get the occasional song on the album. He wasn't writing songs at the beginning. But his guitar work was so integral to the music they were developing. But then, of course, he gets encouraged to start writing songs. I think possibly why Abbey Road is my favourite Beatles album, well, it is at this time on this morning, is because George's musical contributions are great, but as a songwriter, they're on a par with John and Paul. And as we know, when the Beatles split up, George brings out a triple album, All Things Must Pass. And you think, yes, he was younger, and Paul's admitted it, he looked down on him like a little brother. But he was so, so talented. That's what got him in the group. And that's what helped him mature as a musician and as a songwriter. And George Martin has said he maybe should have paid more attention. For when you got Lennon and McCartney, it's difficult to do that. And I think one of my favourite all-time quotes has to be from Frank Sinatra. And he talked about George's song, Something. And he says, "Something is my favourite Lennon and McCartney song." I think, oh, poor George. So I think, and I'm sure, you know, give us some feedback on this, but George was underrated as a guitar player, as a songwriter and a singer, certainly at the beginning. But you cannot take, just as you can't take Paul or John or Ringo out of the Fab Four, can you imagine what the songs would be like without George's guitar work, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and I agree with you totally, Dave. Yeah, very interesting. But if anyone wants to share their views on that, they can do on the Facebook page of LilyPod. So today on LilyPod 6, we've been talking about George Harrison and looking at the places where he lived and also his contribution to the Beatles as a musician. But we were talking earlier to Dave about the MBEs, the Mr. Brian Epsteins. We've had a number of them, and please keep sending them in via Facebook. But just tell us before we finish LilyPod 6, Dave, which of the MBEs we're going to be looking at next time.
We're going to give it to someone who's underrated by a lot of people, unknown by many Beatles fans, and that's Mona Best. And what she did, not just because she was Pete Best's mum, but she opened the Casbah Coffee Club, which is an incredible place. So Mona Best, MBE, brackets LilyPod.
That sounds good. And next LilyPod, we will also be looking at the contribution of the Casbah and things like that. You're going to be having a chat with Rogue Best, aren't you? And we'll be covering that particular aspect and awarding the MBE to Mona as well.
Yeah, so we'll be looking at, obviously, the Casbah is an incredible place, birthplace of the Beatles. And also talking about Rogue, about the new museum that he's opened with Pete's help. the Magical History Museum down on Matthew Street. Some great things there. So we'll do a nice chat with Rogue. He can talk about his mum and what an incredible lady she was, talk about the Casbah and the Magical History Museum as well.
So from Dave Bedford and me, Paul Beasley, that's it for Liddy Pod 6. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Liddy Pod, Beatles banter with Bedford and Beasley.